Late August of 2023 came in hot and bright outside Hastings in Adams County, and the gravel lot at the county equipment sale looked like a showroom for modern debt. Newer pickups sat in rows with polished wheels and dealer stickers. Hank West arrived in a rust-streaked 1997 Ford F-250 with 312,000 miles on the odometer, a cracked bench seat, and a tailgate that needed a shoulder nudge to latch. He stepped out in patched overalls, a faded seed cap, and boots cleaned by use rather than polish. Three growers standing near the bidder table looked at him, then looked past him, the way people look through a man they assume is only there for coffee and free donuts. The arithmetic under that appearance told a different story. Hank farmed 1,260 acres in a corn and soybean rotation, owned 940 acres debt-free, rented the remaining 320 on fixed cash terms that did not float with commodity panic, and ran his personal annual budget at $34,800. His peers, many of them younger and sharper dressed, carried machinery notes that exceeded Hank's entire operating line. He still carried a flip phone. He still wrote checks from a plain leather book. He still tracked costs in a handwritten ledger with columns as straight as fence wire. None of that looked modern. All of it was liquid strength. Calvin Rusk saw him and smiled the way a manager smiles when he smells an easy audience. Calvin ran the premium new wing at Tri-Valley Ag Equipment, wore a press shirt with a stitched logo, and drove a black 3/4-ton pickup that had never hauled a gravity wagon. Standing with those same three growers, he laughed and said, loud enough for six more to hear, that a man who still ran a flip phone had no business buying harvest equipment in 2023. The laugh was clean and public. Hank did not answer. He signed in, took bidder card 117, and stood by the fence where the older machines were parked like forgotten uncles. He had stood in that position for 30 years, not always at this lot, but always at the edge where value got mispriced. Hank's discipline did not come from a dramatic speech or a single lucky crop. It came from watching one generation get trapped by borrowed shine. In 1987, when he was 22, he watched neighbor Roy Bell lose 480 acres after variable notes reset into double digits. Roy had been a good operator, not careless, not reckless, just leveraged at the wrong moment. The auction lasted 5 hours. Roy cried once, then shook every hand. Hank went home and wrote one line in a notebook. Never let weather and interest rates meet in the same room with your name. His first real numbers were small and stubborn. In 1991, he cash rented 160 acres at $72 per acre and grossed $53,440 on corn and beans combined, then netted $11,380 after fuel, seed, fertilizer, rent, repairs, and crop insurance. He did not upgrade anything. He banked $9,000 and left $2,380 for living. In 1992, he netted $14,220 and saved $11,500. In 1993, he netted $18,040 and saved $14,000. By spring of 1994, he had $38,900 liquid. He kept pressing through that season and bought 80 acres for $68,000 cash before year-end. The sequence kept repeating with variation, but not with drift. 1999. Bought 120 acres for $132,000, put 50% down, paid the balance in 4 years. 2003. Bought a used planter at auction for $2,900, then spent $740 rebuilding row units instead of financing a $28,000 replacement. 2008. bought a foreclosed quarter for $214,000 cash when fear froze bidding. 2012, replaced two bins roofs for $18,600 cash, added aeration fans that reduced spoilage loss by 1.8%, worth roughly $11,900 per year at then current grain prices. 2016, added 160 acres at $4,900 per acre, no debt, total cost $784,000, paid through accumulated cash, and a 6-month treasury ladder he unwound at maturity. 2021, prepaid anhydrous at $690 per ton, saving $730 per ton when it spiked to $1,420, with total fertilizer savings of $86,870 across his acreage. He did not build wealth by heroic yields. He built it by removing forced decisions. In average years, his corn ran 197 to 214 bushels per acre, and soybeans 58 to 66, respectable, but not magazine cover numbers. What made his operation different was his cost stack. No machinery principle and interest eating the center. No operating line panic when rates moved. No emergency equipment purchase in October when a dealer had leverage and a producer had none. His annual household spend sat on one page. Property tax on the home place allocated at $6,900, utilities $4,320, groceries $8,400, medical and insurance out of pocket $7,180, fuel and vehicle maintenance $3,600, clothing and incidentals $1,700, church and local giving baseline $2,700, total $34,800. The margin stayed in the business or in cash equivalents. By the second week of August 2023, he had $612,000 in near-cash accounts, $8,000 in checking, no revolving balances, and crop inputs largely prepaid. His estate planning worksheet, updated by a local accountant, who had stopped trying to persuade him to use more leverage, showed total assets at $9,310,000 and total liabilities at $570,000, tied mostly to seasonal payables that would clear at settlement. Estimated net worth, $8,740,000. He looked like a man one breakdown away from trouble. In practice, he was a man one check away from optionality. Early discipline for Hank was never abstract philosophy. It was routine. He walked auctions with a flashlight and a notepad. He asked for maintenance logs, touched bearings for heat, and checked wear points where paint could not lie. He bought an older grain drill for $400 and put $280 into opener discs, then seeded 600 acres with it over 6 seasons. He bought a 60-foot auger for $1,100, replaced 2 joints and a motor starter for $620, and skipped a financed unit priced at $18,900. His shop inventory looked like a museum shelf, but acted like an insurance policy. Belts labeled by width, used sprockets measured and tagged, hydraulic hoses staged by length, 2 rebuilt alternators ready in boxes, and filter cases bought by pallet when winter discounts hit. That discipline reached its clearest form at the Adams County sale that morning. Calvin was trying to move new combines priced between $540,000 and $612,000 at 7.4% interest over 10 years. On a $576,000 unit, with 15% down, finance balance of $489,600, annual payment set near $69,800 before insurance, software subscription, and service package add-ons pushed real annual outflow close to $76,320. Hank stopped at the oldest machine on the lot, a 1981 International Harvester, 148, showing 6,940 engine hours, tired paint, and a feeder house leak that had scared away casual bidders. He bid once at $6,500, once again at $7,200, and the hammer fell. Calvin shook his head and told the nearby growers that Hank had just purchased a very expensive lesson. Hank drove the 1480 home with a borrowed escort truck, then opened his parts list. Belts and chains, $1,940. Bearing set, $1,280. Auger flighting and patch steel, $2,460. Feeder house floor and labor from a local welder, $1,740. Rebuild hydrostat unit, $2,200. Fluids, filters, and contingency parts, $240. Total rehab, $9,860. Combined with purchase price, total harvest capacity cost, $17,060, paid in cash, no monthly note, no lender call, no software lock. For Hank, the deciding question had always been simple when framed against weather and markets: lower paint age or lower fixed obligations. That principle, tested over decades, was about to decide one township inside a 36-hour weather window. By the time the machine was field ready, 2 weeks had passed and forecast models began flashing the same narrow opportunity across every farm app in the county. One dry 36-hour window, then an early plains ice storm. Hank topped off the fuel tank, set spare belts in the service truck, and wrote 3 numbers on a shop whiteboard where only he would see them. Total combine cost $17,060. Available liquidity, $612,000. Debt service on machine $0. Then he went to the field. The first pass through his own south quarter told him what he needed to know about the old 1480. Cylinder speed held steady. Grain samples stayed clean enough to sell without apology. The feeder house leak he had patched with flighting steel and careful welds stayed dry under load. He ran one hand on the hydrostat lever, one eye on header height, and kept the pace just below strain. A newer machine might have pushed faster. Hank was not racing iron. He was racing weather and penalties. At the edge of the field road, Calvin Rusk stopped in a polished pickup and climbed out in a pressed dealership jacket, clean cap brim, and jeans still creased from a hanger. 2 growers stood with him, arms crossed, watching the old combine move through corn that tested 18.7 moisture by Hank's meter. Calvin raised his voice over engine noise and said Hank would lose that feeder house by sunset and spend the storm paying custom rates he could have avoided with proper financing. Hank did not shut down to answer. He lifted the unloading auger, dumped 312 bushels into the grain cart, and took another pass. By noon, the county agronomy text chain filled with harder numbers. The dry window had narrowed from 36 hours to 31. Sleet band arrival moved up to early Thursday morning. Elevators posted fresh warnings that wet loads after the front could take moisture docks from 18 cents to 27 cents per bushel, and test weight discounts up to 34 cents where quality slipped. On 180,000 bushels spread across one township, that kind of downgrade could erase well over $90,000 in 1 week. The breakdown started almost on cue. Eli Morton called first, not in panic, but in the flat voice of a tired man doing math he did not like. His 2020 combine threw a software fault tied to a clean grain elevator speed sensor. The part sat in Omaha, but remote authorization had to clear before install, and the technician queue was 12 machines deep. Eli had refinanced 2 units into one package the previous winter, balance $418,000 at 8.1%, with annual payments of $62,244. Missing his contract delivery window meant a basis penalty that could hit another $21,000. Good yields would not rescue timing. Dana Ruiz called 40 minutes later from a field entrance west of Juniata. Her rotor drive had a hydraulic pressure fault and would not reset. She owed $296,000 in short-term notes tied to a variable operating line that had reset above 9%, and her monthly interest carry alone now crossed $2,200 in heavy draw periods. She had done what extension meetings and lenders had encouraged for years: expand efficiency, keep acres turning, leverage scale. The model worked in ordinary years. This was not an ordinary year. Then came the Jensen brothers. Cole and Travis had 2 late-model combines and a grain cart package financed at a total of $1,140,000. Their annual machinery burden sat just over $156,000, before insurance and prepaid service contracts. One combine was down for a sensor harness issue. The second could run, but only if a dealer technician cleared a fault lock tied to emissions diagnostics. They had 1,980 acres to finish, and a lender field officer had already requested updated harvest progress by evening. Across the township, the arithmetic was already diverging into 2 columns: finance capacity waiting on permissions and paid-for capacity already turning acres. By early afternoon, radar showed the leading edge of the system tightening over western Nebraska, shaving 1 more hour off every plan that depended on tomorrow. Hank kept harvesting his own acres for another hour, then pulled onto the road and drove straight home without calling anyone back. He parked behind the machine shed, walked through the mudroom, and sat at the kitchen table where the varnish had worn pale near the edge from 30 years of elbows and checkbooks. He opened the same ledger Calvin had mocked months earlier, turned to a blank page, and wrote 4 names in a left column: Morton, Ruiz, Jensen, Jensen. Then he wrote a 5th line above them: storm liquidity allocation. He had $612,000 in near-cash accounts and another $8,000 in checking. He kept a floor reserve of $300,000 for his own operation going into winter. That left room to move if he stayed precise. He transferred $184,000 out of a money market position before the bank's cutoff, then decomposed it into 3 buckets designed for speed rather than ceremony. $68,000 for fuel and labor coverage, $54,000 for emergency trucking and grain handling, $62,000 for temporary drying and storage offsets at the cooperative. The terms were written in 12 words beside each name: 0 interest, pay after settlement, principal only, if yield fails, extend. He made 6 calls in 22 minutes. 1 to the cooperative manager authorizing charges against his account for drying and temporary storage related to those 3 operations, cap $62,000. 1 to his fuel supplier prepaying $24,000 for dyed diesel draws by Morton and Ruiz, then a second fuel prepay of $18,000 linked to the Jensens. 1 to a trucking outfit in Hastings booking 4 semis on standby at $142 per loaded hour plus fuel surcharge with a $20,000 retainer wired immediately. 1 to a local mechanic, Ray Dobbins, securing mobile support at $165 per hour with a guaranteed minimum of 16 hours through the storm window. 1 to Eli. 1 group call to Dana, Cole, and Travis. He kept the explanation short. Machines are tools. Debt is the storm. There was a long silence on that group call. not from pride, but from relief colliding with embarrassment. Dana accepted first. Eli accepted next. Cole said they would sign anything. Hank told him there was nothing to sign tonight. Finish acres first. By dusk, all 4 operations had shifted into one improvised harvest grid. Hank would cut his remaining north blocks through midnight, then rotate to Eli's east quarter at first light. Dana's lower ground would run second before field roads softened. The Jensens would keep one machine moving and stage carts to reduce unload idle time. Ray Dobbins would float between sites with belts, hydraulic hose stock, and a service truck already loaded with filters and sensor bypass kits where legal. The co-op manager, Lila Brenner, flagged each incoming ticket tied to Hank's allocation so penalties and drying charges could settle later without freezing deliveries. No one on that call talked about pride again. They moved directly to sequence, fuel, and road conditions because every delayed decision now had a dollar figure attached by the approaching front. At 7:18 p.m., a fresh weather ping confirmed sleet timing was holding on the earlier track. By the first week of October, most people in that township remembered only 2 sounds from those 31 hours: sleet tapping machine glass and old engines refusing to quit. Hank's 1480 ran 18 hours straight with breaks only for fuel, grease points, and 1 feeder chain adjustment made under work lights at 2:10 in the morning. Fuel burn averaged 1.8 gallons per acre in corn and 1.3 in beans. He tracked every gallon in the ledger margin. At dawn, he had finished his own acres and moved to Eli's farm with 14,200 bushels already in storage, moisture averaging 17.9 and test weight holding above contract minimum. Eli's down machine stayed down. Dana's reset failed twice. One Jensen combine came alive for 4 hours, then faulted again. Hank did not comment. He cut. The practical advantage of old mechanical systems showed up in small moments that never make brochures. When a belt heated, he replaced it from his own part stock in 12 minutes. When grain loss crept up, he adjusted fan and sieve by hand without waiting for software prompts. When an idler bearing started to sing, Ray swapped it from the back of a service truck for $84 in parts and 20 minutes of labor. No authorization queue, no encrypted lockout, no waiting for a laptop. The money side was even clearer. During that storm window, Hank spent $11,420 of the $184,000 allocation. $6,730 diesel draws, $2,416 trucking retainer usage, $1,144 drying offsets posted same day, and $1,130 mechanic labor and parts billed to the support pool. Every dollar had a line item, receipt, and purpose. Meanwhile, each idle hour on the Jensen finance pair represented roughly $35 in payment burden before fuel, labor, and depreciation. At 12 idle hours in a day, that was $420 burned without cutting a row. By then, the contrast no longer needed argument. One balance sheet was burning time through fixed obligations, while another was converting liquidity into harvested acres and preserved contracts. As wind speeds climbed and visibility dropped, the township started measuring success in loads delivered, not model year. Calvin drove out again late that afternoon, this time without an audience. He stood near the headland while Hank unloaded on the go into a cart Cole was driving, and he watched 2 things that did not fit his sales model: acres finishing and penalties shrinking. He finally asked Hank quietly whether he wanted to trade up after harvest if the dealership could structure favorable terms. Hank wiped dust from his glasses with a shop rag and gave the same answer he had given for years. No note, no rush. Calvin looked toward the highway where two of his newer units sat waiting for technician clearance and did not argue. He took off his cap, ran a hand through his hair, and asked one practical question instead. How many more acres could Hank cut before midnight if trucking stayed on schedule? Hank gave him the number, exact and plain. About 420 if weather held. 3 hours later, with sleet beginning to needle across the lights, that estimate proved conservative. Hank crossed the final pass on Dana's last block and folded the header at 11:40 post-meridium. Grain carts lined up in sequence. Test weights held. Moisture discounts stayed within survivable range. Across the 4 operations, preserved premiums and avoided docks were already penciling toward 6 figures in protected revenue, with settlement sheets to confirm the final total. At the co-op scale line after midnight, the same growers who had laughed at bidder card 117 watched trucks roll over in order, each ticket stamped and logged. Calvin stood beside the window with Lila Brenner and spoke without theater. That old machine, he said, had finished acres and retained cash when newer units could not. In that week, that was the only metric that mattered. Hank did not answer with a speech. He signed 2 fuel receipts, 1 drying acknowledgement, and a trucking summary, then clipped all 3 into his ledger. Physical evidence in order, external calls completed, every promise traceable. When he climbed back into the rust-streaked Ford, patched sleeve catching briefly on the door latch, sleet had turned to freezing rain over Adams County. He started the engine, let it idle for 10 seconds, and drove toward home with the heater on low, already calculating what each neighbor would owe, what each could carry, and what portion he would quietly erase before spring. By 1:07 in the morning, Hank had the Ford backed into the shed, the ledger open under the kitchen light, and 4 settlement sheets laid side by side with a carpenter's square to keep the columns aligned. Freezing rain ticked against the window. He wrote what each family had drawn against the storm support structure, then wrote what each family could actually carry without getting pushed into another refinance cycle. Morton account. $38,440 authorized for support access, with $24,000 as a realistic near-term repayment ceiling if his contracts cleared clean. Ruiz account. $29,860 authorized, with $16,000 collectible this crop year without forcing operating stress. Jensen account. $41,700 authorized with $28,000 collectible if corn held above $4.60 cash. He circled the gap between authorized capacity and prudent repayment, then dropped to the transaction layer that mattered more than any forecast. Fuel drawer slips, 2 emergency trucking invoices, co-op drying entries, 1 mobile mechanic bill from Ray Dobbins. The first pass showed a mismatch he did not trust. He ran receipts to check register, then back to co-op ticket, IDs, and prepaid draw notes. A missing $1,144 drying offset appeared on the portal printout and closed 1 hole. A duplicated mechanic line opened another. He corrected both, reran category subtotals, and rebuilt the page from 0 instead of patching over mistakes. By 2:12, the ledger finally held the same number from 3 directions. Storm support actually consumed $11,420, exactly what the field log had shown during the run. He wrote the forward assistance line clean beneath it. $184,000 authorized, $11,420 used. $172,580 untouched. Then he turned to the deeper column he trusted most, the one that explained why he had been able to move money without asking anyone's permission. He labeled it Capacity Built Without Notes and ran it year by year in the same narrow print he had used since he was 22. 1991, net savings $9,000. 1992, net savings $11,500. 1993, net savings $14,000. Running liquid total $34,500. Then $38,900 with side work and grain carry. 1994, land purchase, 80 acres for $68,000 cash, ending liquid $6,200. 1995 and 1996 combined after-tax savings, $31,440, plus custom planting income, $7,800. Liquid back to $45,440. 1997 drought year, net only $8,960, but no principal due, no forced sale. 1998 rebound, net $26,300, liquid $80,700. 1999, 120-acre tract at $132,000, with $66,000 down. 4-year amortization, self-imposed at zero lender penalty, paid from operating surplus, $17,400, $18,200, $15,900, $14,500. Deed clear by 2003. He marked that year twice because ownership shifted his rental risk permanently. The sequence accelerated in ways that looked small inside each season and decisive across 15. In 2004, total machinery repairs were $21,740 against gross farm receipts of $412,600, or 5.27%. A neighboring financed operation that year carried principal and interest at 18 to 22% of gross, depending on yield. Hank's ratio left room to pre-buy chemicals when discounts appeared. In 2006, he prepaid seed and nitrogen in December, saving $19,480 compared with spring posting. In 2008, during the credit panic, he bought the foreclosed quarter for $214,000 cash and leased 80 acres of it back to the seller's nephew at below market rate for 3 seasons so the family could stay in production. Rental income from that arrangement averaged $142 per acre, modest on paper, but the land appreciated from $1,337 per acre purchase basis to $3,850 by 2013, adding $402,080 in unrealized equity while generating operating cash. By 2010, his owned acreage had crossed 520, then 680 by 2016 after the 160-acre addition at $4,900 per acre. That purchase, $784,000 total, came from a treasury ladder and retained earnings rather than an agricultural mortgage. He noted the foregone interest he gave up by using cash, then compared it with mortgage exposure at the rates offered that summer. A 20-year land note on $500,000 at 4.9% would have generated total payments near $789,000, with roughly $289,000 in interest. Avoiding that obligation protected flexibility in 2018 when basis widened and fall cash flow tightened countywide. From 2017 through 2022, he averaged annual net operating retention of $286,000 after all farm expenses and his fixed household budget of $34,800. He did not chase lifestyle creep. He kept the same house, the same Ford, and the same repair-first machinery policy, then pushed surplus into money markets, treasury bills, and opportunistic land bids. By harvest 2023, that discipline produced the near cash position Calvin had mistaken for absence. Before we go any further, if you want to see exactly how one handwritten ledger outperformed 10 years of glossy financing brochures, subscribe now, because the next phase turns from one storm to the choices that made that storm survivable. At 6:30 that same morning, after 2 hours of sleep, Hank met Lila Brenner at the co-op office to reconcile wet load adjustments and premium preservation. Final scale data confirmed what field math had projected: $42,600 in preserved test weight premiums across the 4 operations and $67,900 in avoided moisture dock losses. Combined protective effect, $110,500 retained in one weather event. Lila printed each ticket and stamped the back with settlement references, then slid copies to Hank for his neighbor's files. He did not keep the originals for leverage. He kept duplicates for transparency. She pulled up the flagged routing notes they had used during the storm window. Drying and penalty charges directed against Hank's allocation without freezing deliveries, exactly as planned when the line started backing up and sleet came in sideways. The system had looked improvised from outside, but every load now matched a ticket, and every ticket matched a destination and charge code. Hank checked the timestamps against his notebook, including the 11:40 p.m. final pass out of Dana's last block, then signed off on the reconciliation page. The contrast with peers had never been about intelligence. It was structure. Eli Morton was a disciplined grower who had expanded from 420 acres to 940 across 12 years, then refinanced during a low-rate window and got trapped when repair frequency and interest resets stacked in the same cycle. His 2020 machine package began at 4.2% promotional financing, then reset after consolidation to 8.1%, with service exclusions he had not priced correctly. Payment burden rose from $38,700 annually to $62,244. In ordinary harvest years, he could carry it. Add a fault lock delay in a compressed weather window and one missed contract, and liquidity snapped. Dana Ruiz had built her acreage honestly, from 300 to 780, by taking landlord risk others avoided and delivering clean books to every lender review. Her weakness was not spending. It was variable rate exposure. When short-term operating credit moved above 9%, interest carry consumed margin that had previously covered labor and preventive maintenance. She made timely payments and still got squeezed. Cole and Travis Jensen were strong operators with excellent field execution and good family labor discipline. But they bought 2 late-model combines and a grain cart package in the same 18-month cycle at peak equipment pricing. Their annual machinery burden, just over $156,000 before additional costs, left almost no room for a delayed harvest curve, especially with $1,140,000 tied up in the machinery package. By the time the office filled with routine traffic, Hank had one legal pad page covered with the same hard sentence, repeated 3 ways: debt compresses decision time. Weather punishes delay. Software faults do not care about payment schedules. A part sitting 2 counties away, an authorization code held in a queue, or an interest reset in the wrong quarter could force good operators into bad options. His approach looked old because it rejected that dependency chain before it formed. He did not reject modern agronomy, precision mapping, tissue testing, or yield analytics. He rejected fixed obligations that removed his ability to wait one more day for a better sale, one more week for a better repair, or one more season before replacing iron. Eli came in first, cap still damp from the sleet, and stood by Lila's side desk while she copied his ticket stack. He looked at the totals twice, then once more with his thumb on the moisture column. "I thought we were dead when the lockout hit," he said. Hank answered by sliding over the usage sheet instead of a speech. Fuel draws used, posted. Trucking and handling support, posted. Drying and storage offsets, posted. Total storm window support usage tied to his loads, listed and signed. No interest line. No penalty line. Eli traced the bottom figure with one finger and asked, "How long do I have?" Hank gave him the same 6 words he trusted because they matched his own history. "Until it is done, not rushed." Dana arrived 10 minutes later with her settlement envelope folded into quarters. She did not sit. She read the co-op reconciliations, then the support note language Hank had drafted the night before. Principal only, post-settlement repayment, hardship extension, if yield failed. She nodded once, wiped her cheek with the back of her glove, and said she would not miss a transparent reporting date if Hank wanted monthlies. Hank told her monthly was noise in this window. Accurate quarterlies would do more good and create fewer panic decisions. Cole and Travis came together, both carrying field notebooks marked with acres cut and acres lost to downtime. They were blunt about the part no one likes saying out loud. They had executed well in field and still almost got whipped by payment structure. They accepted Hank's terms again in writing and asked for one condition of their own, not as pride, but as guardrail. Mandatory quarterly reviews of machinery, cost per acre before any future equipment commitments. Hank nodded and wrote the first review line under each name before they left the office. Calvin Rusk stepped in after they cleared the doorway, quieter than he had been at the field edge. He did not reopen the argument from the South Quarter. He looked at the stamped tickets, the preserved premium totals, and the side-by-side support entries, then asked Lila for a copy of the Township Reconciliation Summary. When she handed it over, he scanned the load sequence that had kept grain moving while newer units sat intermittently fault-locked. He asked Hank for the 1480 repair log and hourly field capacity notes under storm conditions. Hank told him he would share the repair log and verified fuel and acre numbers, but not private neighbor finances. Calvin said that was fair and folded the papers into his jacket without another prediction. By 8:40, the office noise had shifted back to normal harvest traffic. Dock questions, test weights, settlement timing, freight calls, but the central arithmetic of the week was now on paper where nobody could spin it. A rebuilt 1981 IH-1480 with a total capacity cost of $17,060 had finished acres, while 6-figure annual machinery burdens waited on approvals and parts. A $184,000 liquidity backstop had been authorized, $11,420 had been used, and the remaining $172,580 sat available instead of trapped in depreciation. 4 operations had kept grain moving inside a 31-hour window that had looked unwinnable when the forecast tightened. Hank clipped the reconciled pages into a manila folder labeled Storm Window and wrote one final line on the cover: "Verify repayment capacity after settlement posts. Not demand date, not collection schedule. Capacity." He tucked the folder under his arm, thanked Lila for staying ahead of tickets when it mattered, and walked back into the cold with the same Ford and the same ledger that had carried him this far. The storm phase was closed. The money phase was just beginning. At the edge of the co-op lot, Calvin caught up to Hank before he reached the Ford and asked the question he had avoided all week. "Are you actually positioned to carry those balances without collateral?" Hank shifted the manila folder under his arm and looked at him without heat. 10 o'clock. Flatwater Community Bank. Bring your calculator. He drove there at 9:45 with road salt still on the wheel wells. Patched sleeve darkened at the cuff from the grain dust and rain. Lila Brenner came in from the side entrance with the co-op settlement packets. Eli Morton arrived with a yellow legal pad folded in half. Donna Ruiz brought her operating statements in a feed sack envelope. Cole and Travis Jensen came together, quiet and visibly tired, boots still holding field mud in the tread. Calvin came last. Pressed shirt, clean notebook, no sales smile. The loan officer, Marlene Keating, closed the office door and set one rule before anyone sat down. Numbers first, pride later. Hank opened his folder and laid out 3 documents in sequence. Estate planning balance sheet, updated 30 days earlier. Cash and equivalent statement, updated that morning. Land schedule with parcel IDs and basis history. Marlene verified each page against bank records, then read the central figure aloud because everyone else was trying not to ask. Current net worth, $8,740,000. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The room did not go dramatic. It went still. Eli looked at Hank's sleeves, then back at the paper, as if those 2 images could not live in the same county. Dana exhaled once and put both palms flat on the table. Cole stared at the land schedule where the owned acreage was listed, parcel by parcel, 940 acres, debt-free, then passed it to Travis without comment. Calvin did not challenge the number. He asked for liabilities. Marlene slid him the second page. $570,000 in routine seasonal payables at the prior update, now declining with settlement postings. No term machinery debt. No revolving consumer balances. No margin debt. The reveal was not that Hank had hidden money in some theatrical way. The reveal was that he had converted 40 years of ordinary-looking decisions into optionality so large that one weather event could not corner him. His truck still had rust. His combine still looked like another era. His math was current. By the 3rd week of October, settlement drafts had posted across the township, and Hank started the money phase exactly as he had written it, traceable, specific, and tied to outcomes instead of sentiment. He did not hand out envelopes. He paid obligations at the source where interest was doing damage. Eli's package came first because his highest rate segment was compounding fastest. The note balance that hurt him most was $120,000 inside the broader refinance at 8.1%, equivalent cost after fees. Hank wrote a cashier's check directly to Eli's lender for $120,000 with a memo line that read, Principal curtailment, highest rate tranche. The lender recalculated the remaining schedule the same week. Eli's annual payment burden fell by $18,960. Over the remaining term, projected interest avoidance on that retired tranche came to $34,680. Hank did not charge interest on the help. He set one condition. Eli would submit quarterly machinery cost per acre for 2 years, so the old pattern would not return under a new paint color. Dana's stabilization required a different structure because her pressure point was variable operating credit, not one fixed note. Her revolving line had climbed to 9.2% during peak draw periods, with interest drag biting hardest between input purchase and grain settlement. Hank wired $82,000 to Flatwater as restricted operating line reduction, principal only, then had Marlene code it, so the line limit dropped with the balance instead of inviting fresh draw creep. That single move cut Dana's seasonal interest carry by roughly $7,500 at current rates. More important, it moved her debt service coverage ratio from fragile to workable before spring input buying began. Dana signed a plain two-page agreement with Hank. 0 interest, 5-year horizon, payment only from net profit above a defined family living threshold. Bad year, no payment. Good year, principal only. The Jensen brothers took the longest because their machinery stack had multiple contracts, cross-collateral language, and one service addendum that punished early changes. Hank sat with Cole, Travis, and Marlene for nearly 2 hours while they decomposed the package line by line. They targeted $110,000 to unwind the most expensive segment and avoid default trigger clauses that could have pulled other notes into review. Hank funded the $110,000 as a private zero-interest refinance, documented through the bank for clarity, not control. Repayment would be tied to profit years only. 15% of net farm profit above $180,000 annually. Floor payment 0, ceiling payment $35,000 in any single year. If drought, no payment. If margin, pay principal. The brothers left with a lower annual machinery burden and a rule they wrote themselves in the margin. No new iron without 2-year cash simulation at low commodity prices. Let me stop here and ask you something. If you were offered a bigger machine tomorrow, but the payment schedule removed your ability to wait through one bad season, would you still call that growth? Or would you call it rented risk? Hank returned to third-person arithmetic and kept going. Over 6 months, he wrote 3 checks totaling $312,000 exactly as planned. $120,000 for Eli, $82,000 for Dana, $110,000 for the Jensens. Every transfer had a receipt, lender acknowledgement, and revised amortization printout clipped in one expanding file. Physical evidence submitted. External contacts closed. No loose paper. Generosity did not stop with debt triage because Hank was not trying to win one argument. He was trying to change default behavior in Adams County before the next weather squeeze. In January 2024, he met with Marlene and a local attorney, Nora Feld, to establish the Adams County Equipment Transition Fund with a $500,000 endowment from his cash equivalents. The fund charter was narrow by design, used equipment transitions, rebuild grants, and zero-interest bridge loans for operators under 45 who could document cost discipline and debt limits. No grants for cosmetic upgrades, no money for dealership add-on packages. The first-year cap per recipient was $40,000 with mandatory quarterly reporting on repair cost, fuel use, and cost per harvested acre. Within 90 days, 4 young operators were approved. Mason Keller received $36,500 to purchase and rebuild a used combine header, replacing a custom harvest dependency that had been costing him $48 per acre across 410 acres. His first season savings after repairs and fuel came to $11,920. Priya Sandoval received a $28,000 zero-interest bridge to replace a failing grain dryer fan system before harvest bottlenecks set in. Drying losses dropped by 1.4%, worth about $9,300 that year. Luke and Aaron Bell, farming ground once tied to Roy Bell's old foreclosure line, received $40,000 to acquire a paid-for grain cart and truck retrofit package. Haul efficiency improved enough to cut field idle and save an estimated $13,700 in custom trucking and delay costs. The fourth recipient, Janelle Price, used $22,400 for planter rebuild components and variable rate controller repairs that raised stand consistency and lowered replant expense by $6,100 in one season. By spring planting, total deployed from the fund stood at $126,900, leaving $373,100 principal in reserve. plus interest earned inside the fund account. Hank required each recipient to sign one clause he considered non-negotiable. When their operation reached stable surplus, they would mentor one newer farmer for 2 seasons and share full cost sheets, not success slogans. 3 days after the final spring paperwork cleared, Calvin asked for a meeting at the dealership office. Hank came in the same overalls and set one folder on Calvin's desk, containing anonymized cost-per-acre comparisons from funded recipients and from his own storm window logs. Calvin read for 20 minutes without interruption. Then he said quietly that his premium new inventory wing was generating commission now but setting up payment stress later for buyers who did not scenario test rates and downtime. He did not ask Hank for a testimonial. He asked for permission to host open book payment workshops with Marlene before any machinery contract signing. Hank said yes, if the workshop included worst-case yield and rate assumptions, not brochure assumptions. Calvin agreed. If you are learning something from this arithmetic, pass it to one person who still believes a bigger payment is the same thing as a bigger operation. The deeper examination sat in Hank's own ledger, where he matched philosophy against compounding numbers year by year and forced every claim through math. He built the comparison model that winter using 2 pathways for the same hypothetical 1,200-acre operation over 10 years. Path A, debt-heavy machinery cycle. 1 new combine at $576,000, 15% down. Finance balance $489,600 at 7.4% over 10 years. Annual payment about $69,800. Real annual outflow about $76,320 after service and software. Add periodic trade losses and higher insurance. 10-year machinery cash outflow, conservatively $873,000. Path B, debt-light rebuild cycle. Purchase used unit $7,200. Rehabilitation $9,860. Annual repairs averaged $14,500 in high years and $9,800 in low years, plus part stock strategy and local labor. 10-year machinery cash outflow, including 1 major rebuild year and 2 moderate years, $228,400. Difference over 10 years, $644,600 retained. He then ran that retained difference through 2 conservative allocations, 50% into land down payments during weak markets, 50% into cash equivalents at average 3.1% yield over the decade. Under restrained assumptions, retained capital plus avoided interest produced an additional $311,000 in liquidity and equity by year 10, before counting optional purchases made during distress pricing windows. That was the part most people missed. Debt did not only cost interest, it removed timing power. Timing power was where Hank made his largest gains. His recipient trajectory page used the same method. 2023, post-storm, Eli annual machinery burden $62,244. Dana peak variable interest carryover $2,200 monthly. Jensen machinery burden over $156,000 annually. After targeted interventions and restructuring, Eli revised annual machinery burden down by $18,960. Dana annualized interest drag reduced by about $7,500 at current rates. Jensen fixed annual machinery pressure reduced by more than half once one financed unit and related exposure were unwound. Aggregate immediate debt pressure reduction across the 3 operations, approximately $104,000 annually when including avoided penalties, lower interest, and reduced fixed machinery commitments. Over 3 years, even without heroic yields, that relief could preserve more than $300,000 of operating capacity in one township. With average yields, the preserved capacity compounded into solvency, then into choice. Hank closed the ledger for the night, wrote one final notation on the inside cover, and placed the folder beside the door so he would not forget it at dawn. Wealth is what remains when weather, rates, and timing all turn against you, and you can still help somebody else harvest. At 4:52 the next morning, Hank lifted that folder from beside the door, set it on the passenger seat of the rust-streaked Ford, and began the repayment capacity reviews exactly as written. Settlement checks were still clearing, basis was still moving, and nobody in Adams County needed another motivational speech. They needed a working sequence. He met Eli first at the Morton scale shed, coffee in a dented thermos, legal pad open to gross receipts and mandatory outflows. Corn averaged 203 bushels on Eli's harvested acres, soybeans 61. Blended cash price after basis and drying came in lower than summer hopes, but high enough to stabilize if spending stayed disciplined. With the $120,000 principal curtailment already posted, Eli's lender confirmed the revised annual machinery obligation at $43,284 instead of $62,244. Hank set Eli's private payback schedule at $2,000 per month, beginning only after March input bills were covered, then a percentage sweep of 15% from any year-end surplus above $90,000 working capital. By December 2024, Eli had repaid $32,000. By December 2025, another $38,000. In August 2026, he mailed the final $50,000 cashier's check and wrote one line in the memo: paid in full and still farming. Dana's path needed tighter guardrails and more patience. Her 2024 acreage dropped from 780 to 620 by choice, not by distress sale, with a rotation shift toward higher-margin seed beans and contracted food-grade premiums on selected fields. That strategy reduced gross bushel volume but lifted per-acre margin after interest and drying. The $82,000 line reduction stayed locked as principal, exactly as Marlene coded it, and Dana's seasonal interest carry fell from peak levels above $2,200 per month to roughly $1,340 in heavy draw windows. She sent Hank transparent quarterlies. Fuel, labor, repairs, rent, and household draw separated cleanly, no blended categories. In 2024, she paid him $8,000. In 2025, after stronger contract premiums, she paid $21,000. In 2026, she paid $19,000 and remained current on every outside obligation, with enough liquidity to prepay a portion of fertilizer before spring pricing moved. She did not call it recovery. She called it breathing room earned by arithmetic. Cole and Travis Jensen made the hardest structural change because reducing fixed burden required giving up status assets they had once defended. In February 2024, they sold one finance combine, accepted a resale loss that hurt in the short term, and used proceeds plus Hank's $110,000 zero-interest restructure to unwind the most punishing note segment without tripping cross-default clauses. They kept one machine, added a paid-for older backup header, and reset their total annual machinery burden from just over $156,000 to $71,400, including insurance and essential service. The first year after restructuring, they redirected $64,000 that would have gone to fixed payments into working capital and repairs. The second year, they added $48,000 to grain storage improvements that reduced harvest bottlenecks. By harvest 2026, they were not spectacular. They were durable, which was the point. They paid Hank $25,000 in 2025 and $31,000 in 2026 under the profit year formula, with no missed reporting date. By June 2024, the Adams County Equipment Transition Fund had moved from concept into routine underwriting, and its multiplier effect began showing in Plain County records. Mason Keller's $36,500 header project paid back in 30 months instead of the projected 46 because he added 120 custom acres at $39 per acre once his own harvest timing improved. Priya Sandoval's $28,000 dryer upgrade preserved enough grain quality in a wet October to secure a 2-year delivery contract worth an additional $14,800 per year in premium revenue. Luke and Aaron Bell, operating land once connected to Roy Bell's old foreclosure history, used their $40,000 equipment package to cut hired hauling and then leased an extra 90 acres on favorable terms because landlords trusted their cost discipline. Janelle Price's $22,400 planter rebuild lowered replant and seed waste for 2 seasons, then positioned her to mentor a new entrant under the fund's reciprocal clause. That was the cascade Hank cared about. By November 2026, the fund had approved 11 operators for a combined $412,300 in zero-interest transitions and rebuild grants. Those 11 farms controlled 3,460 acres directly, and custom served another 1,180 acres. Documented annual fixed cost reduction across the group reached $287,000 compared with their pre-fund machinery trajectories. Even if commodity prices softened, that reduction represented survival margin. If prices held average, the same margin became retained capital. Retained capital became choice. Calvin's resolution came without theater, and that made it credible. Through winter 2024, he kept selling new inventory while running the open book scenario workshops he had promised, with Marlene at a folding table in the dealership conference room and spreadsheets projected on a wall where marketing posters used to hang. Attendance started thin. Then lenders quietly began telling borrowers to attend before signing. In those sessions, Calvin stopped leading with horsepower and started with payment stress tests. Low-yield year, high-rate year, delayed harvest year, and combined shock year. He showed where each contract broke. He showed where used alternatives held. By September 2025, Tri-Valley Ag Equipment closed its premium new inventory wing in Hastings and reopened that floor space as a used and rebuild division with tested trade-ins, parts bundles, and maintenance planning built into every sale packet. Calvin's commission dropped the first quarter after the shift, then stabilized as volume rose among operators seeking lower fixed obligations. He did not become a folk hero, and he did not pretend he had invented the approach. He told customers, plainly, that he had spent years optimizing monthly payments for good weather assumptions and had watched too many good farmers get cornered when those assumptions failed. In a county meeting at the cooperative, he repeated the line he had given at the scale that storm night. Finished acres and cash retained are the only metrics that matter when weather closes in. Lila Brenner remained at the co-op, promoted to regional operations oversight in early 2026 after her ticket routing protocols were adopted at 2 neighboring facilities. Marlene Keating kept Flatwater's agricultural portfolio stable through a volatile rate cycle by pushing cash flow sensitivity reviews before approval, and delinquency in her farm book declined. Ray Dobbins expanded his mobile repair route, hired 1 apprentice, and built a parts van model around common failure points that cut average in-season downtime for his clients. Norafeld continued structuring farm transition entities and added the Equipment Transition Fund to a legal case study she taught for rural succession workshops. By harvest 2026, Hank's own operation looked nearly unchanged to anyone driving by at highway speed. Same house, same Ford, now reading 329,000 miles. Same patch sleeves. The 1981 International Harvester, 1480, still ran, though he reduced its hours and scheduled preventive rebuild intervals with the same care he gave ledgers. A quiet estate planning audit that summer reaffirmed what the bankroom had already shown. Net worth at $8,740,000, concentrated in debt-free land and cash equivalents. Liabilities limited to ordinary, seasonal flows that cleared at settlement. He did not enlarge his personal budget beyond inflation adjustments and modest medical increases. In 2026, his household spend was $38,200. The surplus continued moving outward. The full roll call settled by the first week of December 2026. Hank West, still farming 1,260 acres with 940 owned debt-free, still driving the rusted 1997 Ford. Eli Morton, farming 640 acres with one paid-for used combine, highest rate note retired, Hank repaid in full. Dana Ruiz, operating fewer acres by design, current on every obligation, variable rate exposure reduced, quarterly reporting still exact. Cole and Travis Jensen, one financed unit sold, one older primary machine retained, annual machinery burden cut by more than half, private refinance current. Calvin Rusk, no longer pushing premium, new inventory as default, now running used and rebuild sales with mandatory payment scenario sheets before signatures. Lila Brenner, regional operations lead. Marlene Keating, still at Flatwater, still insisting on numbers first. Ray Dobbins, now employing 2 field technicians by late 2026. Nora Feld, Fund Counsel and Rural Transition Advisor. Mason Keller, Priya Sandoval, Luke and Aaron Bell, and Janelle Price, all active, all current, all mentoring at least one newer operator under fund terms. Roy Bell had passed years earlier, but his family name was now attached to acres, being farmed by a debt-light younger generation, which was a quieter form of restoration than any plaque. In the machine shed at Hank's place, the oldest combine sat cleaned, serviced, and shedded before the first hard freeze. 2 newer idle units from neighboring operations, parked there temporarily while paperwork cleared and parts routes were reassigned, looked sharper in paint and far heavier in obligation. That visual contrast carried the thesis better than argument. Weather did not grade paint. Lenders did not discount pride. Interest did not pause for harvest. If you want more field-tested stories where arithmetic beats appearance, subscribe now and stay with this channel. If this story raised a real question for your own operation, put it in the comments with one number. Your current machinery cost per acre. Share this with the one farmer you know who looks modest, drives old iron, and quietly keeps everybody afloat when weather and rates turn at the same time. 3 nights after that final share prompt ran, the meeting room above the Hastings Cooperative filled with folding chairs, boot dust, and manila folders thick enough to stand upright on their own. Lila Brenner stood at the front with a printed agenda, and she opened exactly on time because she knew what drift cost in farm country. Hank sat in the second row with his old ledger on his lap, not at the front table, not under the bright light, while Nora Feld arranged signed fund agreements by recipient number, and Marlene Keating checked identity pages before any numbers were read aloud. The first call was Mason Keller. He carried in the same rebuilt header binder Hank had asked him to maintain, Tabs marked purchase, repair, acres, downtime, and revenue. He read from the page without flourish. Fund support received $36,500. Repair overrun personally covered $2,140. First 2 harvest seasons additional custom work 120 acres, then 170 acres. Net cash gain after fuel and labor $11,920 in year 1, $16,480 in year 2. Principal repaid into the fund by that night, $24,000. Balance remaining, $12,500. Then he handed a new folder to a younger tenant, Gabe Lind, under the mentorship clause and said, "I brought my bad decisions too. You can borrow those for free." The room laughed once, dry and brief, then wrote it down because that was useful information. Lila had split recipient reporting into staged January sessions so each file could be verified line by line. Mason's report closed the first night. At the middle of January 2027 follow-up session, Priya Sandoval presented next with moisture logs that had gone from problem to asset. Her $28,000 dryer upgrade had prevented 1.4% quality loss the first wet season, then 1.1% the next. Contract premium gain, $14,800 per year for 2 years. Additional propane efficiency from fan control calibration, $3,260 saved. Principal returned to the fund, $18,000. Remaining balance, $10,000, scheduled against post-harvest surplus only. She had already taken on one mentorship pair, a brother and sister farming 220 acres outside Juniata, and she required them to submit weekly dryer checks before she answered marketing questions. Process first, price second. Luke and Aaron Bell stood together, each with a copy of the same sheet. Their $40,000 transition package had improved, hauling turns enough to cut custom trucking by $13,700 the first year and $15,200 the second, then allowed them to add 90 leased acres without adding machinery debt. They had repaid $26,000 principal and built a $41,000 working capital cushion that did not exist before fund entry. Aaron looked at Hank when she said Roy Bell's name and finished the sentence he had never gotten to finish at his own auction decades earlier. "We can keep this ground and sleep." That was all she said. Janelle Price closed the recipient block with numbers as clean as ledger paper. Fund support, $22,400. Replant reduction and seed waste cuts, $6,100 first season, $5,400 second. Added custom planting margin from improved stand consistency, $4,900. Principal repaid, $14,000. Current on all obligations, mentorship active with one first-year operator, no late reports. When Nora totaled the board, the multiplier was no longer theoretical. Original deployments to these 4, $126,900. Documented combined net operating improvement across 2 seasons, $92,760 direct and $56,380 secondary through added custom capacity and reduced emergency service costs. Principal returned so far, $82,000. Revolving capacity restored without new debt issuance, $82,000. The same dollars were already helping the next group. Eli, Dana, Cole, and Travis sat through that segment with their own files open, and each of them added one line when Lila asked for veteran feedback to new recipients. Eli said to test payment schedules against the worst week, not average yield charts. Dana said, Variable rate debt looked harmless until timing slipped. Cole said they had confused productive capacity with financed capacity. Travis said he still liked good equipment, but he liked optionality more. None of it sounded like a speech. It sounded like people who had paid tuition in real money and were now handing over the notes. Calvin's resolution happened 20 minutes later when Lila called him up to explain the dealership transition data he had promised to publish. He stood with a stack of customer scenario sheets and read the figures without protecting his old position. Premium new wing closed in 2025. Used and rebuild division opened same quarter. First-year gross margin down 11.8%. Second-year total unit volume up 34%. Delinquency flags among customers who completed pre-signing stress tests down 41%. Customers who chose lower note structures after workshops 63%. Average financed amount per machinery package down from $412,000 to $236,000. Service department, emergency call-outs during harvest, down 27% because older units sold with preventive parts, kits, and failure point inspections. Then he said the line that settled his arc for good. I sold speed when I should have sold resilience. Hank showed me the invoice. No one clapped. They wrote that down, too. A week later, Calvin posted permanent policy at the dealership counter. Every buyer received 4 scenarios before contract signing, including low price, high rate, and delayed harvest. He added one more on his own, labeled software and parts lag, with estimated idle hour costs per day. It did not make him popular with every manufacturer rep, but it kept customers from walking blind into obligations they could not carry through one bad weather window. He remained in business. He changed his model. That was the outcome. On the first Monday of February, Hank closed the last unresolved paper trail at his kitchen table. The storm window folder came out first. He matched each physical receipt to cleared bank entries and stamped them settled. Fuel supplier, zero balance. Trucking retainer, fully reconciled with $3,860 returned after final invoice. Co-op drying offsets posted and allocated to each operation. Ray Dobbins paid in full with signed service log attached. No disputed charge lines remaining. The duplicated mechanic entry from that first freezing night was marked corrected and cross-referenced. Every physical item collected had a final status line. Every external call from the storm week had a documented outcome. He pulled bidder card 117 from the back of the ledger, where it had been tucked since the sale, and wrote one note beneath it. Capacity bought for $7,200. Consequence measured in acres saved. Then he filed it with the state documents not as a trophy, but as evidence of method. By early March, Marlene and Nora came to the farm for annual planning and found the same house, the same patched sleeves, and the same whiteboard in the shop with those 3 numbers still faint under new notes. Total combine cost $17,060. Available liquidity at Storm starts $612,000. Debt service on machine $0. Marlene asked if she could copy the board for a lending workshop. Hank nodded. Nora asked whether he wanted to expand personal draw now that the fund was stable. Hank said no, adjusted only for taxes, insurance, and medicine, and pushed the rest to the transition fund reserve. They walked to the machine shed before leaving. The 1981 International Harvester, 1480, sat cleaned. Feeder house repaired again where wear had returned. Grease points tagged for spring check. Batteries on maintainers. Beside it sat newer iron from neighboring farms waiting short-term storage before field prep, brighter paint, higher complexity, and now managed under stricter cost rules because everyone had seen what timing and debt could do in one compressed week. The final roll call was plane by planning season 2027. Hank West still farmed 1,260 acres, 940 owned debt-free, with no machinery term notes and a net worth structure built on land and liquidity, not show. Eli Morton still farmed, paid Hank in full, and had not missed a machinery review quarter. Dana Ruiz remained current everywhere, kept acreage where margins were strongest, and had rebuilt working capital without fresh variable rate stress. Cole and Travis Jensen ran a leaner equipment plan, paid on schedule in profit years, and declined 2 upgrade offers that failed their own downside tests. Lila Brenner oversaw operations across multiple facilities and kept ticket routing discipline as standard protocol. Marlene Keating's farm portfolio remained one of the healthiest in the region by delinquency and restructuring metrics. Ray Dobbins employed 2 technicians and carried the parts that failed most, not the parts that looked good on shelves. Nora Feld expanded the fund charter carefully and kept legal terms short enough for operators to understand on one read. Mason Keller, Priya Sandoval, Luke and Aaron Bell, and Janelle Price were all active mentors with current accounts. Roy Bell remained gone, but his family name was attached to productive acres again through Luke and Aaron, and that thread was no longer hanging loose. At dusk that evening, Hank shut the shed doors, listened to the latch catch, and stood for a moment between old steel and cooling air. Wealth had never been the truck, the cap, or the paint. Wealth was retained decision time. Wealth was no forced sale in bad weather. Wealth was a ledger that could absorb shock and still create safety for other people. The county had learned to spot it now, not by looking at what a farmer drove into a sale, but by looking at who could finish acres, keep cash, and then help a neighbor do the same.